Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Hope you guys are all enjoying your international breaks. Before we jump into FPL specific content, I wanted to jump into a video that looks at team strengths, but we're also going to evaluate fixtures to target as well, which is something that we'll look towards the end of the video. At the beginning of the video, what I'd like to do is use this as an update of our priors from, let's say, game week 3, where we did this sort of video between 3 and 4, that international break, then looking at what has changed around trends for teams, what trends have stayed the same, and how we're sort of evaluating teams right now, and my general thoughts and feelings, obviously having watched all the matches that I have so far. And then, as I said, when we look into the content later, which is more specific around fixtures and looking ahead from a game week 8+ perspective, what we can sort of evaluate and think about for FPL before we look into assets. If you're very interested in asset specific, I will update a cheat sheet video, but I'm waiting for more international matches to play. We have a Saka injury potentially to look at, for example, that hopefully we'll get better information over when I do the cheat sheet finally. But the first part of the video is always going to be the team ratings, and we're just going to look at quickly the team rating movements from game week 4, technically, where we sort of looked at some of the teams. And I would say from the previous video that I made, I'm just looking at now where the teams have moved and whether I'm actually happy, I suppose, with some of those movements, or whether things have sort of shocked me since the last time we made a video looking at something around this topic. So last time round, we had very, very clearly 3 leading teams. This is exactly the same as it is, but Man City have definitely dropped off a little bit on defense, I think is the most obvious thing to mention. Whereas Liverpool, I would say, have transformed a little bit more into a solidified defensive team, but arguably maybe have taken a step back on offense potentially. I don't think that's necessarily true, but I think Man City have definitely dropped off a little bit. So that's sort of my perspective of some of the teams so far. Arsenal still very clearly maybe the best defense in the league and staying like that, but probably a little bit of ways off Man City and Liverpool when it comes to offense. And then when we look in towards the sort of mid-table, or even that sort of vying for top 4, it's Chelsea, Tottenham, Newcastle, even Aston Villa, I would say. I think that most of the teams here, I don't think I've changed my opinion on them. Even Man United, a lot of people are going to struggle thinking about, hey, is Man United really a team that sits in better attack, better defense? And they are, but you just have to see how much of a gulf there is from the leading teams, and then honestly how small a difference there is with some of the teams sort of chasing, I suppose, where Man United are positionally on these team strengths. And keep in mind, these team strengths are formulated from 11 of 5 team strengths. They rely on not just the underlying data from this season, but many previous seasons, with obviously weightages assigned to, recent games, like, for example, this season, and obviously some of the games that we ended off with last season. So it's a very robust model. And I think it's interesting that what I can mention is that before the season started, bookies had Man United as a top 4 team, like a team that would generally finish in the top 4. And it's very clear that with 11FI and a lot of analytics models, that Man United were never held towards that regard, given how poorly they've played under Erik ten Hag last season. So the fact that they're somewhat in the middle here, I think, is not surprising. I think some people might even say that they're worse, but I think we also just have to be fair with exactly how bad Man United are, and they just aren't that bad. Their performances in terms of outcomes have been specifically poor, but I think in terms of underlying stats, it's mostly still been defense where they look worrisome, and the attack, they just haven't scored goals, but they've still created those chances. But you can argue, of course, that they have poor finishers and things like that, and I probably wouldn't disagree necessarily. So that's just a point to make there. The defense has I'd say, still probably made some strides of improvement from at least when we last saw Man United. But am I too impressed with them whatsoever? Not really. Brighton still look like exactly where they are because they've had some pretty lopsided results, right? A really good win versus Tottenham, but at the same time, just before that, that really, really poor loss versus Chelsea, I think, set them back a lot when it comes to team strengths. And then actually, in terms of all the teams surrounding these areas, I'd say that the most noticeable movement is Nottingham Forest shooting up to that classical Crystal Palace sweet spot of worse attack but better defense. And it's very clear right now that Nottingham Forest are moving up there. Maybe Crystal Palace are actually getting a lot worse. Another thing that I think I've noticed is that Fulham have probably been the most impressive team on both improvements on offense and defense. And sometimes, of course, an improvement in defense will naturally also lead to improvements in offense, right? If maybe you're retaining the ball more, things like that. They obviously have a slightly different backline this year with Anderson in place of, I can't remember right now, but of course the American player that they had who was absolutely shocking and probably not at the level of the Premier League last season. So you've got Everton, who have probably taken a little bit of a step back over the course of the season, but it still seems like they're a strong team. I think on attack, that's where Everton have faltered the most. Whereas Nottingham Forest, actually, a lot of people would probably hold them in much higher regard than Everton, but it seems like they're similarly strength teams. The trend for Nottingham Forest has been better, but actually where it's been better for Nottingham Forest, and we'll look later, is, in my opinion, defense. And so I think we don't need to necessarily overreact to how good Nottingham Forest have been. Obviously, great results versus Chelsea and Liverpool away from home, but that's that. West Ham, generally poor results. It makes sense that they're still sort of in that bottom quadrant there. And then Bournemouth and Brentford, two teams that maybe are the closest, with arguably Fulham right now, I'd say, to getting towards that sort of middle parity section where they're generally an above average defense and an above average offense as well. But they still have a ways to go. And I think, as I said, Fulham is definitely the team that I like the most so far. Wolves have looked really poor, so it makes sense that they've dropped off a little bit. And with the sort of promoted teams and their performances so far, I don't think anything has stood out. Yes, of course, Leicester actually had a great win and some great results recently, to be honest. Southampton played very respectably versus Arsenal, but actually have no results that are tangible right now. Southampton, on a lot of the underlying stats, actually have played really well, but at the same time, it's not like that discounts a lot of their previous performances. I think their best performance might have actually been versus Arsenal, but that wasn't sustainable for more than 65 minutes of the game. So that's something to think about as well. Very much sort of reminds me of Burnley last season, where you see some good performances, some good chances being made, and then the team capitulates closer to the end of the game. So sort of my perception of Southampton, whereas Leicester are sort of grinding out some results, and Ipswich have actually been pretty threatening on offense for the most part. So let's actually have a look at what have been the trends that have moved in both the attack and defense direction. So this is basically from the start of the season, what has been the main changes within attack from an expected goals per game point of view from 11ify and his team strength model. What I'd like to point out at this point in time too is that the reason why you're going to see a lot more teams moving back in attack is simply because there have been less goals scored this season within the Premier League, which definitely points out to this being a trend that we can probably be comfortable with repeating itself over the course of the year for whatever reason. Last season, we saw a huge amount of goal inflation. And so now you're seeing a lot more red arrows for teams, but not significant movements at the very least. And then only a few improvements for teams. And Fulham clearly are the most distinct team when it comes to attacking improvement. Brighton as well. We've seen Brentford. I mean, they've scored early, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've become much better as an attack. However, with Brentford, I think you have to sort of be fair to them and say they've had so many injuries. The fact that they've actually improved a little bit on attack is very surprising, considering the overall context of the league is that there's been an average drop. Chelsea improving on attack is also a good sign. It also sort of suggests moving on from Poch, where I think they ended the season very strong, they actually could, have room to improve, and they probably have done so far within the games that they've played. So Chelsea, very impressive. And then West Ham, minimal movements, Bournemouth, minimal movements. But as you can see, of course, across the league, there have been lots of sort of drops in terms of offense. And within the sort of top teams, you see a little bit more parity, I guess, between Man City, Liverpool, and Arsenal, but they've all dropped in the same direction. Even Newcastle, Aston Villa, Man United, these are teams that have also suffered in terms of offense, whereas your Brightons and Chelsea are the ones within that sort of top half of offenses so far that have actually shown some signs of improvement. And Fulham, once again, making the most amount of improvement. Who knows how far they can really go, but it's been a really impressive push towards that sort of top 10 placing, which they have right now. And actually their best performance was once again versus Man City. So very, very impressive from Fulham. And let's have a look at defense. So with defense, I think one thing to mention is that you're going to immediately expect the opposite relationship with offense, right? If generally there are less goals being scored, you're going to expect that the average defense in the league has improved, which is why you can see so much improvement in defense across the board. But I would say for the big teams, once again, the initial trend that we saw at the start of the season was how good Liverpool defense looked under Slot, and that's very much remained. And the model has picked up on that and continued to pick up on that as they've continued to post a lot of more consistent good results. So that has been a very early trend. Man City defense moving in the complete opposite direction, and probably actually the worst sort of defensive shift across the entire league. So a plus 0.05 expectation on expected goals conceded per game is very, very significant, to be quite honest, because it also has ramifications not only for the title race, but then how we value Man City defensive assets. What's weird, though, I would say with Man City defensive assets is that usually we would probably swerve them because in the past there weren't too many attacking Man City defensive assets, but we do have two players, Enrico Lewis and Guardiola, who are very exceptional with what they can do on the pitch. And so I think that still gives them a little bit of grace and a little bit of leeway as long as their minutes hold true. From an Arsenal perspective, okay, a little bit of a worsening in terms of defense, but look how far they are, I guess, apart from Man City and Liverpool. There's still a lot of ways to go from Man City and Liverpool to even come close to Arsenal defense. So it's actually overall very, very impressive, even though there's been a slight drop off, very minimal for Arsenal. In that sort of absolute mid-table, I would say, where Chelsea are somewhat leading the way, you can see there's just been a lot of good defensive positive movements, right? Fulham, keep in mind that they've made huge improvements on offense, but they've also equally made huge improvements on defense. And so Spurs, Chelsea, Nottingham Forest, Fulham, probably the most impressive out of the bunch. A lot of people might be confused at the Man United defensive movement, but I think it does make sense in terms of if there's anything that we can give credit to Man United for this season, it's probably their defense, nothing else really much more. And then actually all these sort of promoted teams, it seems like our expectations for them were still a little bit kind, right? So it still suggests very much so them and Wolves are easily far and away the teams to target so far based on some of the sort of performances that they put out this season. So once again, when you're looking at the likes of Haaland or Man City facing off Wolves and let's say Southampton over the next 2 weeks, it's very much like when Arsenal faced off versus Leicester and Southampton. These are just exceptional games to have. And if you can try your best to target these teams when possible, I mean, try to make, the most of it. Otherwise, I remember at the start of the season, we said that West Ham defensive sort of issues were propping up. It seems like that's been corrected slightly. Brentford have dropped a little bit, and it seems like a lot of they've basically sacrificed what I would say is, defense for offense, which, that's very interesting as a trend, given that the league has moved in the opposite direction. As far as, let's say, Bournemouth, some improvements there, Brighton too. So that's overall, Brighton is another team alongside maybe even, let's say, Fulham, I would say, who have targeted or who have actually just generally improved across the board, attack and defense. Nottingham Forest very specifically in defense. And then Spurs is a team that I would point out right now is very interesting because a lot of people would probably look at a team like Spurs and say that our memories of them last season was that they were a very poor defense. Now they put their worst performance of the season defensively versus Brighton. But I think that for the most part of the season, we've seen an impressive Spurs side so far. And so I'm not going to completely change my mind on Spurs. And I think that's why team strength models are very helpful because you don't necessarily have to have your understanding of a team or perception of a team colored by just one game and one poor experience versus Brighton. Whereas overall, over the course of the season, Spurs have also made significant strides as a defense. And still, when you look at the run of games to target, that makes them so exciting to look at. So that's actually the team rating movements. And I hope you guys appreciate that a lot of the team rating movements are not going to be a mirror of the Premier League sort of underlying XG and XGC table. Neither is it going to reflect the Premier League points table either, because we're looking at mostly underlying data and then also updating our priors and not just relying on what the fixtures have been played so far. Because if you played 7 games within the season, fixture difficulty is still going to be extremely significant. What team strength models do is that they kind of adjust for the difficulty because they already have an expectation of how tough opponents are. And then obviously the model movements really are how far you've shot over expectations or how far you've undershot over expectations. So that's why I really like using team strength models as opposed to just using the XG table 7 game weeks in, because you haven't even faced every single opponent within the league. And we know that home and away is so significant when it comes to coloring our understanding of Premier League games. So that's team strength models. And once again, big shout out to Evelyn. Have a look at his link to his website in the description. He has his own fantasy football sort of fast model. He also has his team rating models and his points predictions as well for the Premier League. Lots of content as well as some sort of podcasts too that he goes with several guests, John McKenzie being his most recent one. So do have a look at his website at 11ify.com. Now we're going to look at another piece of content from 11ify as well, which is actually just to look at what fixtures there are to target, given that we're a fantasy channel and we're still interested in using the kind of team strength lens to understand what is the best way to target certain teams and even certain players. Now, I've always mentioned that when we look at defensive fixtures to target, it's a lot easier to pick assets from defensive teams because a lot of the points from defenders come from clean sheets. It's very rare to have an attacker or a defensive player for a poor team, for example, get most of their points or be useful at all simply because they're a good attacker. So James Justin, Ait Nuri, Leif Davis are probably the three exceptions right now that we can see look quite interesting from these really, really poor defensive teams. But I think they are exceptions to the rule for the most part. But you guys are all going to be aware of them specifically. James Justin actually doesn't have great underlying stats. He's actually been someone who's underperformed. But I think we can also apply a little bit of a legacy tax to him because or legacy buff to him because I think he generally is just a good player. So there's that. Anyways, let's have a look at some of the sort of team predictions. In terms of the team predictions, more so from the goals conceded point of view, I would say that once again, it's sort of looking at the attacking strengths from before, contextualizing them with the fixtures ahead. And we're looking at the next 6 fixtures from match day 8 to match day 13 or game week 8 to game week 13. Spurs clearly have the best run of games relative to the cost of their assets, I would say. You've got players like Solanke, Brennan Johnson, and Madison, who I think are the most exciting to me for now because I'm a little bit uncertain about Son and his availability. But because he's actually taking an international break or taking a break at the international break, Son becomes quite interesting if he actually is ready and available to play in game week 8 because that's actually a really good fixture for Spurs. So he's definitely an interesting buy. And for a lot of people who actually own Saka, I can actually think that holding Saka wouldn't make sense if you have any doubts of him for game week 8. Moving towards Son for 4 fixtures, if he's completely fit and confirmed by Ange, who actually doesn't lie as much as, let's say, Mikel Arteta does, you would get, I think, a lot of positive swings from making that gutsy move from Saka to Son if that works out the way that I think it should. And that simply is just looking at the expected goals really for these teams here, a huge gulf between Spurs and Arsenal for the next 4 game weeks. Why not consider a bit of a short-term rental of Son if you are someone who currently owns Saka and is willing to dispose of him if there is any sort of injury doubts whatsoever applied to Saka. Saka so far has looked like a much better pick per game than Son, but when you contextualize that the gulf in the fixtures are that disparate and there's a bit of doubt attached towards Saka, I think that's what makes the transfer worthwhile. As far as Liverpool, they're very, very good as a team and they'll always find themselves top of the table. But we know that their better fixtures, as I've mentioned in some of my sort of transfer plan videos, is really game week 10 plus. Match day 8 and match day 9 as a culmination is a bit poor. So it's more about looking at Liverpool ahead now. I would actually say that the players that I'm interested in would be someone like Diogo Jota, where because Darwin Nunez, once again, as a trend that we've seen, just clearly is struggling to get minutes under slot, and it seems like isn't sort of fulfilling the needs of slot. As long as Jota is someone who is match fit, I mean, I imagine he's going to be an amazing pick for game week 10 plus. For Man City, though, they actually just generally have the best run of games. So a really clean slate here from match day 8, game week 8 to match day 12. And ultimately, it's a question of whether you can, let's say, guarantee Foden's minutes and maybe invest into double City offense. For people who don't own Haaland, this could be the run of games where you consider moving into Haaland if you've been able to stack up free transfers. At the same time, if you've been able to be successful without Haaland, I can understand a lot of managers still wanting to ignore Haaland because you're taking a almost calculated bet against the field with the ownership of Haaland, despite the fixtures being so good. I would still say that at this point in time, though, there is risk attached to that just because of how good game week 9 is. For example, let's say you're holding someone like Salah through game week 9. That's a huge swing in terms of the expectations there to even, let's say, consider going without Haaland. So something to think about, particularly if you are a Salah owner, I would say. As far as some of the other trends that I find interesting, United have a good run of games, and this is still, I have to say that the bookies have always been extremely high on a team like Man United, but 11-5's team strength model has always been a lot more grounded in reality, particularly on the underlying data. And despite how bad Man United look on paper so far, I still think that they're a team that's worth considering, but we still struggle to pick any asset that isn't Bruno. And Bruno still has quite a bit of cost associated with himself. So I can understand people ignoring Man United for now. But given that they're sort of such a balanced team when it comes to attack and defense, probably it's actually Man United defense that is worth a look at. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Chelsea, though, what's So interesting about Chelsea is that they actually have one of the worst runs of games when we look at the fixtures. But actually, when it comes to where they rank now, I think it shows how much of a stride Chelsea have made over the last few seasons in terms of improving to once again being a top level offense. That even in a really poor run of games here, the expected goals are still very, very high. So that's a really positive sign if you're owning Chelsea picks, that actually they just seem to be very strong, like very much holding Liverpool defenders would be over a poor run of games, given how strong they are right now. Other trends, I would say Brentford still continues to have a good run of games. Other than that, Aston Villa, their run of games, if we remember and call back to looking at the fixtures when we were looking at game week 4 and beyond, Aston Villa's run of games is clearly getting worse. Brighton's run of games is still, for the most part, very poor, but they have individually really good fixtures on game week 9 and game week 13. So if you own, let's say, someone like Dunk, you can play him specifically on those fixtures, but as owning an attacker, maybe Welbeck is still a quality pick, just given his price point, or the same with João Pedro if he comes back. But you have to be sort of aware that you probably can't play Brighton players, or you wouldn't want to play Brighton players in game week 10 and game week 11 as an example. And when you look at the overall sort of 6 fixture landscape, it's just really poor for Brighton. For Newcastle, I would say it's the same thing, because game week 8 is a nice game, but after that, fixtures do run pretty dry. For a team like Fulham, though, they've been actually steadily improving as a team. And so when their fixtures get a little bit better, or even now you can consider, because the cost of their assets is so low, they're still definitely a team to look at. With Crystal Palace, they've always been a really poor offense. And we always tend to find a team like Crystal Palace and Nottingham Forest closer towards the bottom of the table, regardless of how good their fixtures are. Crystal Palace's fixtures are slowly improving, though. I'd say after game week 8, you generally have a clean slate of games. You might even want to consider Eze on a wild card in game week 8. But I know a lot of people are against the idea of going for Eze because, of course, of the blank so far. And then also just looking at ultimately future price drops being very realistic given his sort of initial high ownership. So that is something that's real. But I think when you look at, let's say, someone like Chris Wood, and if you're still fond of someone like Chris Wood, I wouldn't necessarily ignore someone like Eze for now, because I still think that he's actually a very valuable pick towards the game. And I still like him a lot. With Bournemouth, though, fixtures are really, really poor between 8, 9, and 10. And so once again, they're a team that I would just immediately look at from an 11 plus point of view, and after that as well. With, let's say, teams like West Ham and Everton, the run of games is really good for Everton, but you can just clearly see how poor Everton are as a side by just looking at the expected goals here. It's still very, very low for Everton. So it just shows you, how weak I suppose they are as a team, despite the fixtures actually being good. But that's not necessarily always a problem, right? Because if you're technically a talisman, let's say you're on penalties, you are still probably going to get the most amount of chances on the team, like someone like Calvert-Lewin would, or even Dwight McNeil through set pieces, then that's still totally fine. You can still get avenues towards points, even if you're playing towards this absolute bottom half. And that still applies to players within the Leicester team, within Ipswich, like Liam Delap, who's been really impressive so far, or even, let's say, someone like Tyler Dibbling, where most of the players that you own within these teams, you're going to be rotating them no matter what. So when I look at teams to target, like Wolves is definitely a team that I would be looking at from a game week 9 or 10 plus point of view, especially after ignoring that Man City game. With, let's say, Liam Delap, this is actually the run of games I would still own him for, because it's actually a really good run of games for Ipswich. With Southampton, I would be looking at someone like Tyler Dibbling, who I'm going to be playing myself for game week 8, because there's still going to be fixtures within a tough schedule, despite how you might be poorly rated as a team, where you can definitely still play a certain player. Like 1.59 is very respectable for Southampton on a game week like game week 8. So that's it for goals. As far as clean sheets, I would just like to point out what the differences are in terms of trends, right? Brentford sit a little bit higher here compared to some of their peers. Brentford, I think, were something like 8th, maybe on that sort of expected goals table. In terms of clean sheets, they're 5th. So it just shows you a bit of the gulf in terms of clean sheets and, let's say, offense. And you can see it so clearly with a team like Chelsea, who were still very, very high, I think top 6 in terms of expected goals for offense. And then actually in terms of clean sheets, they're very, very low here, simply because the run of games is just that devastatingly bad. On top of that, I think the other trends to mention is that this is just generally a really poor run of games for Aston Villa. For Bournemouth, still a team that has been really impressive so far is Fulham. And then the flip side of, let's say, the Nottingham Forest and the Evertons is that this is actually still a good run of games for them, particularly when you're targeting their defenses, because you can still expect, hopefully, some clean sheets over the course of this period. And this would be the period to own such players when players like, let's say, Sells is 4.5, All the fullbacks, Milenkovic are 4.5 and Nottingham Forest, and Everton. Hopefully Mikalenko comes back and he's still a 4.3 pick, but otherwise, if Branthwaite is still injured, Michael Keane still plays. Things like that are a big positive. Whereas obviously with Brighton, Aston Villa, it just shows you that the run of games is truly poor, and you're not expecting many clean sheets over this run of games. So something to mention as well is Liverpool just continue to look really, really good. And over the course of the season, I'm sure we might even see them closer towards Arsenal and Man City over sort of similarly close runs of games. But there's still quite a big gap between what the model sort of evaluates as the quality of the Arsenal defense and the Man City defense before Liverpool are to sort of get close to there. So there's still a bit of a lag there. But that's that really. Man United, as I said, potentially a team to target on defense. I would probably still swerve them intuitively on offense, given the cost of Bruno as well. But if you own Bruno, it's also ultimately a great fixture in Gameweek 8, and then you can probably reassess is how I would approach owning Bruno for now. Because Gameweek 9 and 10 are tougher, but then Gameweek 11, that's actually a good run of games, 11, 12, 13 for United. So if you want to sort of wait for Erik ten Hag to be sacked, potentially 11, 12, 13 is actually a good time to revisit someone like Bruno Fernandes as well, and even some of the other United players if you actually want to look into defenders. And that's pretty much all I would say right now. So there's definitely a team to target here, generally speaking, which would be Fulham as well. I think Anderson is a 4.3 defender within the game. Leno is much more expensive, but you've got routes towards some top 10 level defenses that are 4.3 million in price, with Mikalenko potentially if he's back, and then Anderson at 4.3. So that's actually a generally quite promising sign. It shows you that there's a lot of value to be earned within the game if you sort of respect the run of games ahead. So I think definitely, for example, if I was recommending wildcard, I would actually recommend someone go for Anderson, because that's actually a very simple way to get access towards a very competent defense, relative towards the price that you're sort of paying for a certain player. And that's pretty much what I would say in terms of the what we've learned series so far. Very nice to see some trends that we spotted early within Game Week 4 continuing, particularly with Liverpool. I think Fulham have actually been even more impressive as I've watched them game to game. And as I said, the best game so far was definitely versus Man City. The sort of underlying data that they posted within that game was very, very impressive, both on the defensive end and the offensive end, particularly when they're actually facing a team like Man City, who've been so tough and so good at home for a while now. And that's pretty much all I would say. So thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the series. Let me know if you guys have any questions when it comes to assessing some of these teams and these fixtures, or evaluating some of this data as well. We'll look at the cheat sheet very shortly in potentially a week's time. I'm going quickly off towards a vacation this weekend, and hopefully we'll be recharged and back to provide some more content as we look ahead towards another great game week of FPL in Game Week 8.